Mick Palmer is my name. I'm a former career police officer and barrister at law. I had about 33 years service in policing, including some 7 years as Commissioner of the Northern Territory Police and then 7 years as Commissioner of the Australian Federal Police. Since my retirement in 2001, I've been involved in a series of reviews and inquiries for state and Commonwealth governments and have been involved in drug advocacy, I suppose, for some 20, 25 years now.
Fantastic. Mick, please proceed with your presentation.
Thank you. Essentially, I guess I came to the realisation several years ago that our prohibitionist approach to illicit drug policy is badly broken. Essentially, it's ineffective and I think on reflection probably always has been. And that despite our very best attempts and endeavours over a long period of time now, drugs really are as readily available now as they've ever been. Experimentation is probably at an all-time high with an ever-widening array of increasingly dangerous drugs available for use. Marketplace is totally unregulated and controlled by organised crime figures and drug trafficking criminals make huge profits, pay no tax and follow no rules other than their own. As a consequence of that, our policy is one that really desperately needs review. I arrived at this conclusion, I guess, irrespective of the evidence that now is clearly available, in my view, from other countries around the world and the numerous commissions of inquiry and reviews that have been conducted in recent years. But I now find, of course, as I guess anybody who looks would, that my opinion is strongly corroborated by those inquiries and reviews, and the evidence in support of consideration of change is, in my view, almost overwhelming. I understand, that to be responsible public policy must be evidence-based, and I understand the reason for political caution in terms of considering change and the need to bring the public with us. But policymakers must be prepared to seek and test the evidence wherever it can be found, and I think this is not currently occurring within the Australian context, and it is something which desperately needs to happen. In regard to the use and possession of currently illicit drugs, Australia's policy surely should be changed from one of criminality to one that primarily is aimed at minimising harms. We have a drug policy, illicit drug policy, that talks about minimising harm, but in fact we don't achieve that aim, probably never have. It should be aimed at minimising the harms caused by drug use and actively protecting the health and well-being of drug users, drug addicts and drug victims. Whilst controlling and reducing drug-related criminal trafficking and related offences must obviously remain an important part of any strategy, it should be complementary, in my view, to the primary aim of providing health and social care and support for drug addicts and drug users. And while that should not be construed as suggesting encouraging drug use, if you like, or even condoning it, it must be a policy that is aimed at understanding the reality that people will use drugs, do use drugs, and will continue to use drugs regardless of whatever laws are in place, and that our whole focus has to be on minimising the harms to those people who choose that pursuit. Contrary to public opinion, I think frequent political assertion, law enforcement of illicit drug trafficking, use and possession, really has had little positive impact on the illegal marketplace, or for that matter on the Australian marketplace, or for that matter the international marketplace, ever. We've never reduced demand, we've never reduced supply for more than a very short period of time. Price goes down, supply remains undiminished, and demand remains the same, or in many cases, in regard to certain drugs, increases. We probably now have better trained and generally better equipped and resourced policing than we've ever had in our history. We're pretty effective police forces in this country, probably as effective as any in the Western world. They're probably more effective now than at any time in our history, but on any objective assessment, policing of the illicit drug marketplace has had almost no impact on the profitability of the drug trade or the availability of illicit drugs. At the local level, young Australians can and do purchase illicit drugs with ease and generally with impunity. In any conversation that occurs, however, about changing our drug policy, it'll be important to divorce emotion, in my view, from the debate. A lot of emotion gets involved in discussions in regard to drug policy, and going soft on drugs is an often touted sort of first response to any suggestion of change. I think we need to realise that there aren't any good or bad people in this discussion, only very concerned people. And this fact needs to be recognised and respected in the overall discussion process. As I remember reading one of the advocates for drug law reform in South America, one of the countries most impacted by it, said not many years ago, we owe it to future generations to be realistic. Drug use does occur. To be prepared to listen and consider these commentaries and to examine the facts and the options available to us. Within the Australian environment, I ask the question, why in the face of poorly performing policy would we not be prepared to consider and benefit from drug policy changes and experiences in other parts of the world and try new ideas when the ones we have are failing miserably? I don't know, Commissioners, if you want me to continue going or just to answer questions. That sort of summarises my views. I've got a range of ideas, I guess, as to how any journey forward should occur, which I'd be happy to share if that's relevant.
Mick, for the public record, we have some time available to us, and it would be very useful if you did expand a little further on some of those suggestions you have. There will be a high level of interest, I suspect, in your presentation and others today, so please proceed.
All right, thank you very much. I guess the simple overriding fact, in my opinion, is that, with the best intentions in the world, we simply, as many other people have now said, we simply cannot arrest and imprison our way out of our present dilemma. It's not going to happen. It's never worked and will never work. And anyone who takes 5 minutes to look at the United States environment would have to come to the same conclusion. Huge amounts of money spent on a problem that continues to get worse. And drug supplying countries to the south of the United States, such as Mexico, obviously now suffering huge rates of crime and homicide and huge violence, simply serving a marketplace on which trillions of dollars are spent controlling drug use and possession. Doesn't work. I'm not suggesting we must be prepared to try new ideas and approaches, and I'm not suggesting going soft on drugs, but rather getting smarter about the way we deal with drugs. As I said, I think the central plank of any current illicit drugs, of our current illicit drug policy, is harm minimisation. The central plank has to be harm minimisation, but the approach of the policy has to be one that gives us some realistic chance of achieving that aim. As a starting point, I think we need to recognise that to improve its effectiveness, Australia's illicit drug policy should be reframed as primarily a social, health and economic issue, with policing playing a strong, targeted support role aimed at the organised criminal marketplace where the benefits of police intervention are highest and the risks and dangers, particularly to the most vulnerable in our society, are lowest. Develop strategies to better understand the health and well-being dangers to social users and to addicts, which arise from them purchasing often tainted or corrupted drugs from a totally unregulated black market and then being treated as criminals for doing so. Do we have the courage to trial new approaches, but we do so gradually and incrementally, with care taken to ensure that the community understands the research and the reasons and benefits that are underpinning the changes and supports that journey as it unfolds. The only way we will get political change, I think, is if the community clearly is in support, as it now is on the back of the surveys that are being conducted in regard to pill testing, with 63+% of people strongly supporting the trialling and use of pill testing at festivals and similar events. Some of the incremental steps, ladies and gentlemen, I believe we could consider are to actively promote awareness and understanding of current decriminalisation arrangements already in place in Australian jurisdictions and the benefits being achieved. I mean, they go unsaid. It goes normally unstated, but there is, as you know, there are a range of provisions for decriminalisation of particularly of cannabis in various jurisdictions, and the benefits that have flown from that are quite obvious when time is taken to look at them. That we adopt decriminalisation as a firm national strategy for personal and recreational use of illicit drugs nationwide. I think we ought to be moving towards that. It would be a very strong and positive step to take. Now, we introduce a policy that clearly distinguishes between antisocial behaviour and the drug use that may have contributed to it. That is, we punish the criminal behaviour, but we treat the drug use. Sometimes the criminal behaviour will be caused by people committing crimes such as robbery to obtain money to buy the drugs, to feed their habit. In other cases, of course, particularly ice that gets so much public mention, the violence may be caused by the use of the drug itself. But whatever it is, we need to separate the antisocial behaviour from the drug use if we're going to stop the merry-go-round that currently occurs and stop the rate of recidivism in our prison system, amongst others. Implement a policy that aims to engage with and support drug users not to isolate and punish them. Create an environment within which people are likely to talk to each other, learn and to teach, and to change behaviours. Like happens at the interactions that have occurred at the 2 or 3 trials that have occurred now at festivals in Australia, and I know occur in many locations in Europe, where doctors and other medical professionals are talking to people who are bringing drugs into testing facilities and being able to give them advice in terms of why they should reconsider their approach, what is the danger involved in what they intend to do, etc. The more we engage rather than isolate and divide, the more likely we will have of changing behaviour patterns. As a trial, I believe we should commence pill testing as a matter of urgency at festivals and similar gatherings, with a view to achieving really 3 things. Obviously, reducing harms, and the recent festival, as I understand it, in Townsville only a few days ago was a classic reflection of that. I read where 59 people were sent to the hospital and some 20 were admitted and 11 overnight or something. I mean, the figures are frightening. And it seems to me that a government that, in the face of that clear evidence of the dangers involved in what is occurring, who sits on its hands and does nothing, really creating a situation where they're becoming potentially liable for negligence. I mean, there are things here that clearly can and should be done, that have been done with success in other parts of the world, and in the face of that sort of evidence, should not be ignored in our country. We have to surely, as part of that testing, encourage users to become more aware of the quality and toxicity of the drug they're planning to use and the dangers that may be associated with it. Tell the truth for the people who are taking drugs, tell the truth about any adverse reactions that may result from such use, and report accurately any health problems to authorities. At the moment, they're likely to tell lies, to pretend they've got food poisoning when in fact they've had an overdose of drugs at a festival for fear of getting into trouble. Very unlikely to tell the truth to family and friends if they think they're going to be disappointed or ashamed by their behaviour. Everything about that environment, it seems to me, is counterproductive to what we really should be trying to achieve. We need to increase funding of treatment options for people with drug use and addiction problems to a level sufficient to create the capacity, quality and flexibility of treatment options to meet realistic demand. Not push this in a corner. Photographs on the front page of major newspapers showing men kneeling in gutters, injecting themselves with an illicit drug while people walk past carrying briefcases on the work. I think there are photographs we ought to be ashamed of. Introduce initiatives to reduce the size and profitability of the black market, with the intent of very gradually moving drug supply as far as we sensibly should from the black market to the white market. Unless we can find some way to reduce the black market and the lucrative nature of the profit that flows from it, and increase the size of the white market, law enforcement will always chase its tail, and we will always have the same problems we have now, in my view. Implement strategies aimed at increasing employment and re-engagement options for addicts and released prisoners, who are often in the most awful of situations, particularly in terms of imprisonment, which I know is one of the focuses of your inquiry. I've been involved in a couple of prison inquiries, both in Victoria and Tasmania, and the situation faced by prisoners who've well and truly served their time, often for quite moderate offences, when they get released, is bleak to the point of almost being hopeless. And in my time in Tasmania, I was actually involved in an inquiry when people were released on a person released on one day on a cold night, broke into a place called Shelter, was arrested the next morning still lying asleep, and was put back into brief parole when he'd been released, of course, with no funds that enabled him, no family, no funds that enabled him to do anything about his own comfort and well-being. I mean, the whole process, it seems to me, is so fundamentally flawed that we almost ought to be ashamed of it. Significantly increase the certainty and cycle of funding for NGO treatment facilities. Consider the establishment on a trial basis of controlled drug consumption rooms that are now flowering and flourishing across Europe to assist in containing, managing and reducing episodes of drug abuse and the consequent likely harms, and the results that are being achieved in now 8 or 9 or more countries in Europe are really very, very positive. They get active steps to improve the accuracy and relevance of drug testing of vehicle drivers. There are some failings in that, as members of the Commission may know, some of the drug testing can identify drugs that may be in the system for many days and may be having, in fact, no impact on the driving ability at all. I'm very concerned about driving safety, obviously, but we do need to make sure that the testing we have is likely to be achieving the aims we want to achieve, and that is maintaining safety on the roads, not just simply punishing people for having taken illicit drugs sometime in the past. Cannabis is an example of one that is likely to test quite some time after the use has occurred, when there is no impact on the driving at all, no measurable impact that anybody has been able to identify. Prohibit any form of advertising. I think this is important as we move forward. If we do move forward to any sort of regulated supply, we don't advertise it. We go, we avoid the track that the circuitous track that's making went down, and alcohol, I guess, is still involved in banning any advertising related to regulated supply, and strictly govern and regulate approved suppliers and cultivators, so that the governments really manage the marketplace. Just a couple of other things. I think it would be wonderful to consider the implementation of a number of pilot studies in at-risk, particularly remote and low socio-economic communities, both urban and remote, to assess causes, problems, social healing options, and pathways towards better health and well-being. Instead of just locking up the symptoms, we should go looking at the causes and trying to find solutions to the causes of the problems that create the behaviour that most concerns us and is most dangerous to the people engaged in it. Identify and engage local champions to drive and encourage the pilot study programs with a view to creating pilot areas as centres of excellence, so we can learn from what's occurring in one community and pass it to another. Increase capacity in the use of interventions for young people and linked to meaningful workplace or workforce strategies. I think that's a really important part of the equation. I've worked quite closely for some time now with Matt Knopf and the Ted Knopf Foundation, and sat across tables from these young street kids who are finding refuge in the Wayside Chapel and Ted Knopf's facilities. And some of the stories would make you weep to hear them. Even as a hardened police officer, I hear some of these kids' stories who are only 14 and 15 when they're telling them, and it's amazing to me that they're still finding the strength to move at all. And they need all the support we can possibly give them. Some people come out of hideously horrific backgrounds and circumstances and have been preyed upon from a very young age. And if ever there's an example of drug use being a symptom rather than a cause, it is in regard to many of those young people. Any review and reform process must include a strong strategy to engage with the public, as I said before, and it must be recognised that community leadership and support will be crucial to the achievement of any meaningful improvements or changes to our drug policy outcomes. I think that's critical. I think it's well and truly achievable now. I think the lights have gone on in many people's minds, and there's an increasingly good or better knowledge of the reality of drug use in the community than certainly than there was some little time ago, and that continues to improve. I think pill testing has really brought that to the fore, where, of course, the audience is almost overwhelmingly a totally law-abiding audience of young men and women who would otherwise never come to the attention of police for anything. And I think that's got the attention. Sadly, it takes those sorts of issues sometimes to get the attention it should. If somebody fits the bill in terms of the behaviour pattern, the wider community may not be quite as concerned if it's somebody that surprises them in terms of their behaviour pattern or the outcomes that are achieved from it. I think there are lots of things that can be done. I think there's a huge amount of fault with what we presently have, and as a country, and as states within a country, we are in a position to do something much more constructive about it than is presently being done. Thank you.
Thank you, Mick. Strong presentation. Commissioner Fredericks, do you have a question for Mick?
Thank you for your presentation, Mick. That was really informative, and could see that was really grounded in your years of experience, and we're thankful to hear that experience and the information, and that you've read well as well. Just a few questions I have in terms of the pill testing. I just want you to tease some of those thoughts out a bit more around, in a practical sense, how would that happen, for example, at a festival? How would that take place?
Well, I think the way by which it should take place, the most advantageous way and the safest way by which it can take place, is the way in which it took place in Canberra just a very short time ago, where you have there is a combo. Everybody is on board in terms of supporting the process that is being applied, including the local police, who are seen then as friends and supporters of the festival goers, not as enemies or people who are there to apprehend, but rather people who are there to support in regard to just use and possession. That there are doctors in the tent, that it is clearly signed, and I know that in the Canberra situation there was no signing, so although some 250, I understand, people presented with drugs, and that probably reflected, I would think, from my own knowledge of festivals and the fact that very few people go on their own. If 250 presented with drugs to have them tested, they probably represented some 750 to 1,000 that would be going on behalf of 2 or 3 friends with whom they went to the festival. Toss a coin to see who presents the drug. It's very likely to have been the situation. So it's a pretty strong response. Despite the fact there was no signage, they hadn't reached the stage where they would agree to allow signage to show them where the drug testing tents were. So you had to find your own way, if you like, or ask. So despite that, though, there was a big presentation. I think everybody, I forget the exact numbers as I wasn't there, but I think it was something like 7 potentially fatal toxic doses were identified. All of those were thrown away, as were many other drugs, I understand, which were tested and found to be polluted by the doctors. Having doctors present who can give advice, this is a medical examination, a hospital-style medical examination and test, where you are spoken to by senior and well-experienced medical practitioners, including doctors, and given advice as to why you should reconsider what you're doing, advice as to the dangers involved in what you are considering doing, advice as to the symptoms if you still continue to take the drugs despite them being tested, or if they happen to test what you thought you bought as what you thought you bought and you're determined to still do it. Advice as to what symptoms you will suffer if in fact you have an adverse reaction and what you ought to do about it, which is why I think probably, even though it occurred in Canberra, not in Townsville, we're now seeing 59 presentations at hospital in Townsville on the back of that festival. I think the lights are coming on again in young people. They realise when they start to get some adverse reactions how potentially dangerous this might be, even though they had taken the risk in the first place, and are much more likely, I think, now to present to hospital and have it double checked than they would have been a year or so ago. So I think it's a case of a government commitment that sets the ground rules clearly, that explains, instead of allowing it to be the individual discretion of police officers, which of course will vary between officer and officer, gives a clear overriding discretionary advice or instruction to police as to the role they should play in these circumstances, as happened in Canberra, to my knowledge, and that works very positively. It takes away the fear factor. It takes away the conflict, if you like, or the division between those young people who are intending to use drugs and the police and medical professionals and others who are going to be there to support them should something go wrong or to respond to an issue if it occurs. So, in a sense, you create a single team rather than a divided audience, and then you have the best possible medical advice provided. The tent, it will become, as it has in Europe, it becomes its own leveller. Behaviour patterns are changing in many places now. I understand from what I'm reading in Europe, user levels going down, some dealers going broke for being identified as people who are selling corrupted drugs. I mean, it acts as a regulator of quality. It's the second best situation, obviously, but it's a big step in the right direction from what we have at the moment, which is no control over the process, no idea of the toxicity or level of corruption of the drugs you're buying, and no way by which you can get them tested. I think using doctors, treating it as a medical intervention, clear advice, clear signage, and police clearly as part of the solution, not as part of the problem, takes us a giant step forward to changing behaviour patterns on the ground.
Thank you, Mick.
Mick, you've got a long and strong background in law enforcement. You've got a profile. I'm sure you've advocated a range of these ideas to various bodies and governments over time. Why do you think there isn't an openness to taking a radical change in approach to managing or handling this problem in Australian society?
It's a very good question. I've had some conversations. You're right, I have had a range of conversations, and the comments here privately are very similar to those that I've read from senior politicians in Europe who basically were saying, we all knew what to do, we just didn't know how to get re-elected after doing it.
Yeah.
And there'll be no change on my watch commentary that you'd have heard leaders in both state and federal arenas say in this country in the last few years is a pretty common statement to be made. But and I have spoken to a couple of senior politicians privately, I've spoken to them privately, they've said, I knew we shouldn't be doing what we were doing, but I couldn't find an option. I couldn't find a politically viable option. I think we're a conservative country, essentially, in that sense, albeit changing. I think politically, until very recent times, that's why I think the level of support for pill testing is now so important. There's been a fear that any sort of loosening of the drug laws will be seen as going soft on drugs and will cost either side of politics votes they can't afford to lose. So it's all about political safety and not being sure whether or not the public will like the idea. My own view is that I think that's changed quite dramatically, that it is quite easy now to engage in discussions and debates, if you like, or even through a drug summit, to widen the level of knowledge and understanding amongst the community as to what is trying to be achieved, so there'd be no chance that it would be seen as going soft on drugs. My own view is I think it's been a bit of a political cop-out, that people don't want to engage in the debate. The best way to avoid the problem is not engage in the debate in the first place. And so the starting point for any suggestion of discussions or summits is to say there'll be no change on my watch, or just say no is the answer. Clearly the evidence says they are not the answers. And the evidence through Europe, and now as you well know, in many states in the United States and growing, there's a very high level of community of government awareness and government commitment to change. Canada just regulated the sale and use of cannabis.
Do you think
cannabis.
Do you think that's part of the issue around the decriminalisation of some drugs, around the perceptions?
I think one of the major concerns in Australia certainly is that we can't afford to get on the slippery dip. We never know where it may take us. The move towards, say, pill testing will be a move towards wider decriminalisation, which will be then a move towards legalisation. And there's the fear of, will we control it once we start the journey? And I mean, I guess my answer to that is, well, that's what governments are paid for, to control regulatory change and change in our community. That's why we elect them, and that's what they do. And it's well within their ability to slow the rate of any movements that occur. I think the move towards decriminalisation would be a very sensible one. To take away the criminality from simple use and possession would be an enormous step forward in terms of changing the psyche within this country and the psyche of young people towards police. I mean, police have never needed young support in this country more than they do now. Street policing is more dangerous now than it's ever been in our history, and much more dangerous than in my time. Very few people were carrying knives, and almost none were carrying guns when I was a young police officer on the street. Now it is pretty common, not only for them to be carrying them, but be quite prepared to use them against police and even medical practitioners responding to sick people. I mean, it's a different environment. They need every friend in town that they can get, and the closer we can make the relationships between young Australians and the police officers who are there essentially to protect them. The police spend a lot more time protecting people than they ever do arresting them. The better we will be. And decriminalisation of drug use, which is just, whether we like it or not, is a reality of modern life, would be an enormously positive step forward in that direction with almost no political risk.
Mick, it's Kim. We've changed our views on water usage, on climate change, on alcohol, and a range of things to varying degrees over the years. Can we educate our way through this drug issue, or is it really going to take the changes you talk about? Is there an educational campaign to inform people of the risks and the consequences of drug use and the sorts of things they're ingesting? Will that work, or really are the things you're advocating the only possible solution you see?
I think they're the only positive solutions. They're ones that are most likely to make a significant difference. Education campaigns, the experts tell me, I'm not as expert on this as many others that I've been working with in recent times, but their advice is, and I think it's pretty clear it's the case, the education campaigns have only been very modestly successful, very slow, very modestly successful. Perhaps we could do more. I'm sure we could do more to educate. There's a lot of education occurring now. You're smart about drug campaigns in schools and so on. There's lots of education that occurs, but human behaviour is what it is. As young people, we all took risks. Young people always take risks. You don't, as I used to say, young fella, you don't scrump your own fruit. You always climb the neighbour's fence and steal their apples. You don't bother taking your own off your own tree. There's no fun in that. I mean, this is the nature of human existence. Young people will take risks and stretch the boundaries. We need to accept the reality of that. It's not only illicit drugs, it's licit drugs. We are a drug-taking community. The Western world is a drug-taking community. Lots of people take drugs, and they take them way beyond the prescriptive requirements or advice and guidance. I mean, it's the nature of the world in which we live, and I think we need to recognise the reality of that. I think education, Kim, can take a significant part, but I think there is little of any chance it's going to have the impact that we really need to have in this if we're going to change behaviour patterns in the way we would want to do and minimise harms, reduce the harms that have been caused.
Thanks, Mick.
You mentioned, it's Bronwyn, Kim, you mentioned, the violence on the streets with young people and other people, and I'm wanting to hear from you too around, do you think some of that link is connected to some of the types of drugs connected to violent crimes or escalating violence?
Yes, I do, but I think the biggest drug by far in regard to violence on the streets is alcohol. Of course, there are occasions when people, and well documented generally because the violence can be quite extreme, people who are high on ice and having a bad impact as a consequence of their use, the violence there and the strength that can be accompanying that violence can be quite extreme. And that's obviously a big concern. But the numbers of those people are small. I think there's only about 2% of the Australian population that uses ice in total, and only a very small number of those suffer adverse reaction. It's a serious problem, but I think that by far the biggest problem in regard to street violence is alcohol. In a sense, that sort of tells the story, really. It's a legal product. We wouldn't suggest that we'd ban alcohol. But we need to understand that with these sorts of drugs, whichever they are, legal or illicit, that come with some pretty bad side effects, severe side effects from time to time. And if people don't properly control their use of whatever the drug might be, well, the adverse impacts on others might be quite extreme. I think that's got worse. I think the level of violence is not so much associated with increases in, there's probably more binge drinking now than there might have been 10 years ago, if the anecdotal stories I hear are accurate. But I think it's a combination of things, including the fact that, whether we like it or not, sadly, the respect for families, the respect for law and order is not what it was. The freedom amongst young people, a level of knowledge through social media and so on of young people is far higher than what it was some 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, where we could have accepted almost blind obedience or people would simply go along with the instruction. Now that is far less likely. People are better educated, they're more informed, they're much more likely to say their piece, to stand their ground and not just obey an instruction. The whole range of reasons why things can get out of hand much more quickly. So I think it's a combination.
Thank you.
Mick, you made a very compelling point early in your presentation that enforcement's has little impact on the problem, and our police force is certainly of a similar quality to other Western world police forces. There's no enforcement is definitely not the solution. There's not new technology, greater resourcing. There's not a way to enforce our way through this problem.
No, I don't think so for a moment.
Right.
We'll get all those things, and we are more and more effective, I think, over time in interdicting serious and organised drug trafficking, seizing very large quantities of drugs and making very significant arrests. But I guess in a sense, there's Mexico and the United States really, in a sense, absolutely categorically demonstrates the answer to that.
Yep.
Profits are so high, the market is so big. It won't matter how much law enforcement dollar you throw at this; it's not going to make a difference.
Yep.
the level of 12,000, I think, homicides in 12 months alone in Mexico in 2012 or something. Many of whom were just innocent people who refused to support drug traffickers moving through their town or operating in their towns or things of that nature. I mean, the level of violence associated with this because of the profits involved are very, very worrying, or should be very worrying. And the chance of law enforcement curbing it, despite their effectiveness, and we've been quite effective in this country and made some very significant seizures and arrests, but at the end of the day, it doesn't make any difference.
No. Mick, do you have a view on the availability of services for recovering drug addicts? Is that something you've considered during your study of this? Do we have enough support services, enough options for addicts for treatment?
No, I'm not an expert at all, Kim, and I wouldn't pretend to be, but I have had a bit of a look at it in company with people like Alex Wodak and Matt Knopfs and others. Mm-hmm. Of course, no, we do not. Nowhere near enough facilities in the first place. And I think both sides of government have shown an interest in improving treatment in this federal election process, as I understand it. But certainly, I think there is a need for increased treatment. There's always the argument, of course, that if you're going to increase the treatment dollar, it has to come at the expense of law enforcement dollar, and so that becomes a difficulty for governments who don't want to be seen to be going weak on policing and law and order, particularly in view of the other sort of things I've been saying, which are quite right. Of course, street violence and street safety is a big issue politically, and needs to be. So it's not so much taking money from robbing Peter to pay Paul, but rather finding ways to expand the treatment budget has to be increased to become enough to feed the reality of the marketplace. At the moment, particularly outside of bigger cities, the level of treatment facilities is very, very poor. And I think that's what led to the UIC United in Compassion walk, a 400-kilometre walk from Dubbo to Sydney some months ago to identify how far some people had to travel to seek treatment for any sort of drug use or abuse.
Thanks, Mick. Mr. Fredericks, do you have any further questions?
No, I'm happy to open up to the floor.
Mick, we'll open up to the floor for comments. Are there any comments from any of us in the audience today, based on Mick's presentation?
My name's Alison. I was just wondering...
Sorry, Alison, would you mind giving us your full name?
Blackpool.
Thank you.
With regard to disrupting the market by flooding the white market, flooding the black market with placebo drugs, would that indent the control?
I couldn't quite hear that question. It's about the black and white market and controlling the marketplace. Is that the question?
Well, yeah, just disrupting the market, the black market, by introducing placebo drugs into the community, rather than having these black market drugs, so that people would weren't getting what they wanted. So
what they believed they were getting.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not an expert, obviously, and I wouldn't pretend to be in regard to that, but I think we need to be prepared to try all avenues. No one's talking here about opening the floodgates to currently illicit drug use, but rather saying we need to find better ways by which we control and regulate both the supply and, more importantly, it seems to me, the quality.
I think what needs to happen is to take the power away from these subversive, drug dealers, and that is by disrupting their market.
That's right. Well, law enforcement tries to disrupt their market, but I think we've got to find ways to reduce it. We're not very successful at disrupting it. We lock up 10 and 10 more take their place. Yeah. We've got to find ways to reduce the market, which it seems to me the only way to do that over time is to gradually regulate supply of certain drugs and reduce the size of the black market. Using placebos as part of that process, it seems to me, would be a very sensible thing to consider. If we were to take the time to look more deeply at what's occurring now in many countries across the world, we'd probably find some pretty good answers to your question. There are a lot of quite strategically adventurous initiatives occurring now in different parts of the world, where people have come to exactly the conclusion that we're talking about here, that what we've got simply doesn't work and is aggravating harms rather than reducing them. We need to find new ways to do business. and here are some of the ways by which we might just make a difference. And I think it's going to be a suck it and see situation. I mean, there is no perfect solution to this. We clearly are very unlikely, certainly won't happen in any of our lifetimes, that we're going to regulate all the drugs. If we move to regulate drugs, if that was to occur in this country, it'll be a very slow process and a very gradual process, and obviously so it should be, testing as we go. But we need to be prepared to try new ways to do business if we're going to make a difference, and the comment you make should be very much part of that matrix, it seems to me.
Thanks, Mick. Any other comments from the floor?
I just have one more.
Please, go ahead.
I was listening to a podcast by an ex-police officer, and he was saying that the pill testing, it identifies like one.
I don't think so. Mick, are you still there?
I am still here.
I'm not sure what's happening.
I'm on the phone. I'm not sure how that's happening, but it's happening. Yeah, go ahead. It's all right. I just realised what it was.
Okay, no
I
problem.
was too close to my landline.
Okay. So I was listening to a law enforcement podcast that was saying that pill testing identifies one ingredient, for example, but it's actually the whole of the pill. So do you think that they're getting, that say, whatever, festival people, drug people are getting a true picture of what they're taking when it's the whole of the pill?
Well, I can't categorically answer that except to repeat what I've heard doctors say who were present, including people like Dr. David Caldecott and so on. It's a hospital-level examination of the pill. I mean, it's not a fail-safe mechanism, and that's made very clear to the people who present their pills for testing and who have a sample of the pill taken for testing. But it's highly reliable. It's very unlikely to be misleading, albeit it may not pick up every component in the pill. If in fact some parts of the pill are composed of different ingredients to another part of the pill, I guess that has to be a possibility, but on all the evidence it seems that it's very, very unlikely, and it certainly has not proved to be the case in Europe. I think, without knowing exactly what the police officer said and understanding where he's coming from, what's missed here is the fact that at the moment we're doing nothing. We've got no control over the toxicity, no idea or knowledge or understanding of what people are taking, and they've got no idea of what they're buying. They're just buying what somebody told them they were buying. Anything we can do to improve that safety level has to be a step in the right direction. No one's suggesting this is fail-safe, and somebody who's had a pill tested and still decides to use it could still suffer a fatal overdose. You can't guarantee that won't happen, but you can guarantee that it's a lot less likely to happen in an environment where people have the ability to have their pills tested and get good quality evidence as to what it does contain, even if that is not the sum total of what it contains. The Canberra Festival is a classic example of that, where they tested 7 pills that contained fatal toxicants. I mean, potentially fatal overdose pills, which people had bought in good faith. They obviously didn't buy what they believed they were buying. Nobody tried to buy what they bought. Anything we can do to reduce that level of risk has to be a positive thing, albeit it may not be a fail-safe. It's not a fail-safe.
Thank you, Mick.
Yep, just draw it to a close there, this session here. Just a reminder that people can and will be able to view this session from Mick at a later time up on the video once it's uploaded to the web, the QPC site. Mick, I'd just like to thank you for presenting to the public hearing today. That was really informative. I think people got a lot out of your experience and that your knowledge gained through the numerous years of working in policing, not just in the Territory but in numerous places throughout Australia, but also your extensive knowledge of what's happening in other parts of the world. So we thank you for that this morning.
Thank you, Mick.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.